Welcome, everybody. Thank you for showing up for our webinar. Welcome to Breast Cancer Action's Why We Must Stop Fossil Fuels webinar. I'm Heather Sarantis, and I'll be the moderator today. Thank you so much for joining us. Please note that we are recording this webinar and live streaming it on Facebook as well. For 30 years, Breast Cancer Action has worked to address the systemic issues at the heart of the breast cancer epidemic. Instead of focusing on individual actions people should take to reduce breast cancer risk, we focus on holding corporations and industry accountable. Our work is centered around addressing root causes of breast cancer by working to eliminate involuntary exposures to hazardous and toxic chemicals that are present in our daily lives and that increase people's risk for the disease. We have campaigned, and many of you campaigned with us, to reform chemical regulation, ban fracking and dangerous oil in California, and end the use of harmful pesticides. These may seem like separate issues, but today we want to talk about what these have in common. They are all byproducts of living in a society addicted to fossil fuels. In July of this year, Breast Cancer Action released a fact sheet that gives an overview of the links between fossil fuels and breast cancer. Today we want to dive in deeper on these issues. The topic is so big that we won't be able to cover everything, but I'm happy to introduce some very talented women who are going to help us get a better sense of the scope of the problems. First, we're going to hear from Kathryn Rodgers from Silent Spring Institute. Silent Spring Institute is the leading scientific research organization dedicated to uncovering the links between chemicals in our everyday environment and women's health with a focus on breast cancer prevention. Kathryn is going to give us an overview of some of the scientific research that demonstrates the links between fossil fuels and breast cancer risk. Next, we will hear from Monic Uriarte from Esperanza Community Housing. Esperanza Community Housing. Esperanza Community Housing is a social justice nonprofit in South Central Los Angeles that achieves long-term comprehensive community development by developing and preserving affordable housing, elevating health equity and access to care, mobilizing for environmental justice, creating and protecting local economic opportunities, expanding engagements in arts and culture, and advocating for policies protecting human rights. Monic's organization has been involved in frontline fights to protect her community from oil extraction in Los Angeles. They recently celebrated a victory in their effort to end the legacy of Alenco Company drilling for oil only yards from where people in her community live. After that, we will hear from Jayla Burton, Breast Cancer Action's own program officer. As a program officer, Jayla works with Breast Cancer Action to execute the Think Before You Pink campaign and all other national campaigns. She is also active in the Last Chance Alliance, which fights the fossil fuel industry in California. She will give us an overview of Breast Cancer Action's work related to fossil fuels. Just a note on our process, at the end we will have time for question and answers with all of you. Please feel free to write your questions you have for presenters in the Q&A tool, which should appear at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you are having any technical issues, please send a note to the chat box, also located on the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we will do our best to problem solve. With that, I'd like to pass control to Kathryn, and she is going to take it away. Thank you, Kathryn, for joining us.
Hi, Heather. Thank you so much for the introduction. I went too far. Hang on, I'm sorry. So I'll introduce myself. Hi, my name is Kathryn Rodgers. I'm a scientist at the Silent Spring Institute. Silent Spring is a scientific research organization dedicated to studying environmental causes of breast cancer. I want to thank Breast Cancer Action for the invitation to speak at this important webinar today. I study exposures to chemicals that are associated with breast cancer and translate our science to policymakers, businesses, and community groups. I am so glad to join you today to connect the dots between petrochemicals' relationships to fossil fuels and their effect on breast health. As a brief introduction to our organization, at Silent Spring, we use the Cancer Prevention Science Framework as a guiding principle to our work. When we have evidence of biological harm in addition to human exposure, that is the basis for preventing those exposures. Proof of harm often only comes after too many people have become sick or even died. Instead, we rely on the strength of evidence to identify and prioritize exposure reduction opportunities. Many fossil fuel-related chemicals are priorities for action based on this cancer prevention science framework. So there are thousands of chemicals related to fossil fuel sources. Fuels can be extracted in a number of ways, and they're commonly used for heating buildings and homes, either through an electrical grid or through on-site combustion, and for most of our transportation. The products from fuel extraction can also be used to make other chemicals, which are in turn used to make other petrochemicals that can be used to make things like plastics, pesticides, or solvents. And at the end of their life, oftentimes these products are then incinerated, further releasing more toxic chemicals into the environment and ultimately into people. Today, I'm going to walk through 4 chemicals that are related to fossil fuel sources to discuss their associations with breast cancer. There are many more fossil fuel chemicals associated with breast cancer, but today I'm going to walk through these 4, including PAHs, benzene, dioxins, pesticides, and herbicides. Before I delve into these 4 chemicals, I would like to briefly start off by saying that there is no single pathway to breast cancer. In general, we can think of breast cancer arising from 3 different pathways. I'm outlining them because the fossil fuel related chemicals I'm going to talk about can act via these different pathways. First, direct DNA damage can cause cancer. An example of this is ionizing radiation. Studies show that ionizing radiation most strongly increases breast cancer risk when exposure happens before age 20. We know this from following atomic bomb survivors and people who receive high levels of medical radiation. Second, we know that chemicals that mimic or disrupt hormones, such as estrogen, can act as tumor promoters. One example of this is hormone replacement therapy. There is a well-established risk from HRT fueling breast tumor growth later in life, increasing breast cancer risk. Third, chemicals that mimic or disrupt hormones can also change how hormonally sensitive tissues, such as the mammary gland, develop. The mammary gland goes through 3 major changes in life: during in utero development, during puberty, and during a person's first pregnancy. These changes can make the breast more susceptible to developing cancer later in life. For example, studies show that DES, which was a drug used to prevent miscarriages, alters breast development and increases breast cancer risk in women after in utero exposure. Or in other words, if their mother took the drug while pregnant. Silent Spring has cataloged chemicals for effects on the breast. We have identified 216 chemicals that are mammary gland carcinogens and 36 chemicals that alter mammary gland development. We have also reviewed studies of people exposed to mammary gland carcinogens and their risk of breast cancer. All of this information is freely available on our website in our Science Reviews database. In talking about the types of studies that we rely on, we cannot and should not conduct chemical studies like clinical trials. We cannot take a group of people and expose half of them to suspected carcinogens and see who among them develops cancer. Studies with people, or epidemiological studies, commonly enroll a group of people, half healthy and half with the disease, and look to see if there are differences in chemical exposures or other differences linked with the disease in question between the groups of people. Some of the most clear information we have from human studies are from occupational studies or accidents. where people have very high exposures to compare to people with much lower exposures. We also cannot solely rely on human studies because it can take decades for cancer to appear, which is not a realistic way to make regulatory decisions. So we also look to evidence from animal and cellular studies. And from these kinds of studies, we can learn a chemical's pathway to breast cancer, what kind of hormone receptors the chemical might bind to, and how a chemical may stunt or accelerate mammary gland development. When I talk through the 4 chemicals of focus today, I'm going to cover 4 topics. First, I will cover their sources. Second, how people are exposed. Third, what we know from animal and lab studies about what pathways they might act on that are relevant to breast cancer. And fourth, what we know from studies with people. First chemical I'm going to talk about are polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, or PAHs. PAHs are compounds that are produced when organic material burns. They can come from burned fuel, like coal, wood, or gas, as well as tobacco and food burned or cooked at high temperatures. PAH exposures are common, and most people's exposure comes from air pollution, in combination with many other air pollution contaminants. There are hundreds of PAHs, and 13 have been identified as causing mammary gland tumors in animal studies. PAHs can act as estrogens, as well as anti-estrogens. They can also cause oxidative damage and alter genes responsible for repairing damaged DNA. Studies of workers exposed to PAHs found that women workers' risk of breast cancer increased as the duration of PAH exposure increased. And risk was higher among women exposed to PAHs at younger ages, before 36, and when the exposures were from petroleum-related sources. This slide includes findings from the Long Island breast cancer study. It shows the different genes that were affected by higher PAH levels in blood. Studies of women with higher levels of PAH measured in their blood were more likely to have changes in their genes associated with cancer, like DNA repair and tumor suppression genes. Some of the changes in genes responsible for PAH metabolism had suggestive associations with breast cancer. This shows that PAHs may modify breast cancer risk through genetic variants, as well as their hormone-related activity. Given the implications of widespread exposure to PAHs, preventing exposures is a public health priority. Now I'm going to talk about benzene. Benzene is a petrochemical found in oil and gasoline, as well as produced in a lab by chemical manufacturers. It is in the top 20 chemicals for highest production volume in the United States. It is often used as an intermediate for making many other petrochemicals, such as styrene, which is in turn used to make some plastics. People can be exposed to benzene through vehicle exhaust, tobacco smoke, and industrial sources. Benzene is a carcinogen to humans based on evidence of leukemia, though it also has evidence of breast cancer risk. In animal models, it produces mammary tumors by damaging DNA. A worker study of women who were exposed to benzene in an Australian study found an increased risk of breast cancer with any benzene exposure, with higher risks in premenopausal women. A Danish study of men found that men who worked in occupations with likely exposure to benzene had higher risk of male breast cancer, though these exposures likely co-occurred with PAHs and other petroleum-related chemicals. Benzene is a regulated chemical, but even so, it's produced at such a high volume and occurs in commonly used products such as gasoline, which makes it a priority for exposure reduction. Next, I'm going to talk about dioxins. Dioxins are chemicals that are produced from chlorine processing and combustion or burning of waste or fuels. Waste incineration is the largest source of dioxins in the environment today. Because they are persistent and bioaccumulative chemicals, They enter the environment and our food web, and people's exposure largely comes from eating contaminated fat from animals. Animal and experimental studies with the most potent dioxin, called TCDD, shows dioxins can disrupt estrogen signaling and disrupt tumor suppression genes. In animal studies, TCDD disrupts how the mammary gland develops, delaying its development early in life, leading to more ductal structures from which breast cancer can arise, which in turn makes the tissue more susceptible to carcinogens later in life. The most well-known breast cancer study in people exposed to dioxins is from an industrial accident at a chemical plant that happened in Italy in 1976. The explosion resulted in TCDD contamination in the area surrounding the chemical plant. Women who had higher levels of TCDD in their blood had significantly higher risk of breast cancer 20 years later, compared to the women who had lower levels of TCDD. It is unfortunately from accidents like these, with high exposures, that we learn of a chemical's health risks. Now I'm going to talk about pesticides and herbicides. Pesticides and herbicides are chemicals used in agricultural and home lawn care applications. Most pesticides and herbicides are made in a lab, starting with petroleum-based hydrocarbon chemicals. Many other additives, including other petrochemicals, are used in their final formulations. Billions of pounds of pesticides are used every year globally. As I'm sure everyone knows, farm workers are exposed, as are people who consume food grown with pesticides and herbicides. There are many pesticides and herbicides that are considered likely human carcinogens by the International Agency for Research on Cancer. And we have found that some of these are also mammary gland carcinogens. These chemicals can increase breast cancer risk in different ways. For example, some chlorinated pesticides or herbicides, like malathion and atrazine, can alter mammary gland development in rats exposed during puberty. In people, DDT is a well-known pesticide that increases breast cancer risk. Its use in the United States ended in 1971. And a study of pregnant women measured blood levels of DDT while it was still in use in the 1960s, and found that women who had higher DDT exposures had 5 times the odds of developing breast cancer later in life. And their daughters who were exposed to higher levels of DDT in utero had 3 times the odds of developing breast cancer later in life. Other large, well-established studies that did not rely on blood measurements, but asked women if they remembered seeing or chasing a fogger truck as a child before 1972, found that women were more likely to have breast cancer if they remembered seeing or chasing fogger trucks as children. Other studies that did not have blood measurements have also found increased risks of breast cancer with home pesticide use and residents near agricultural pesticide use. Reducing pesticide and herbicide use is the goal of many public health campaigns, especially unnecessary applications like home landscaping or pest control, where safer, non-chemical alternatives are available and effective. I will stop here and say thank you again for the opportunity to discuss the links between fossil fuel-related chemicals and breast cancer. It is clear that in order to reduce exposures to petrochemicals that harm our health, we need a path forward that is not reliant on fossil fuels. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Kathryn. That was a really important overview of just the tip of the iceberg, really, of the problem that we're facing and need to understand better. I was really struck by your comment about how we can't ethically run experiments of exposing people to chemicals and then see what happens. Certainly in a research environment, that's not acceptable, but we know that there is a very steady trend of disproportionately impacting different communities, especially communities of color and low-income communities, to chemical exposures all the time. And so in a way, we are running that experiment with people's lives as we speak. In California here, we have no shortage of communities that have been disproportionately impacted. We want to invite Monique to join us now to tell the story of her community's ongoing struggle with fighting the fossil fuel industry. Monique, let me give you control here. Thank you so much for joining us, Monique. I think, can you move the slides now?
I am trying, yes.
Great, thank you, welcome.
Let me go back. No, I'm sorry.
Okay.
This technology. Good morning, everybody.
Do
Can
you want me to get
help
you to the
me
start of
back?
your slides? Yeah, give me
Yes,
just a second.
please.
Okay.
Yes, thank you so much.
Of course. So
Yeah, good morning, everybody. My name is Monic Uriarte. Thank you, Breast Cancer Action, to invite me to be part of this amazing webinar. And I want to introduce to all of you, this is South Los Angeles. And you see on the map, Alenco, the area is marked, the apartments, high school, and college. Alenco is surrounded by people. And I used to say I love all my neighbors except Alenco, because Alenco is poisoning us. And this community, just to have an idea, we are just on the middle between Staples Center, the Lakers house, and USC, University of Southern California. We are fighting with so many issues, gentrification, lack of resource in our community, and we embark a fight against an oil industry. It's not an easy when you are talking about immigrant community with so many fears and low income and people of color. And this is our neighbor. I took this picture from the building that I used to live. On the back of the picture, you see a second store building, and that is the high school where kids with disabilities attend. To your left, you will see a different windows, and it's the dorms from Mount St. Mary's College. Do you see? They share walls with Alenco. And it's so sad every morning when you see a line of yellow buses dropping off kids with paraplegia or different kind of disabilities. It's a heartbreaking to see. And you see all these move trucks and on the facility of Alenco. This is the rig when they doing a heavy maintenance or extraction work on Alenco. Frequently, we smell the gases, and it's very sad. Then we need to smell because, unfortunately, as Kathryn Heather said before, these kind of activities are more frequently on low-income community. I took this picture from inside of the facility. On the back, you see the building that I used to live among with 14 more families. Sorry. And I want to share this picture. They say poison gas. And we see this is a very, very toxic and dangerous gas, but this label is inside of the facility. Nobody from the community are able to see this label. We start noticing our community that our kids, ourselves, become sick, like headaches, stomach pain, asthma, nosebleed. And we notice then that's not right. We start smelling horrible smell like a guava, cherry, citrus, sometimes rotten eggs. And we put in a table outside of the building with these heads, styrofoam heads, with the different symptoms then the community was complaining about it. People start walking by and asking us, what is this table with these heads? And we are start explaining, look, the smells making us sick, and people start connecting and sharing, I feel this dizziness, I feel this headache, I feel this kind of sore throat, or my kids has a nosebleed. And we start collecting our own data and asking for phone numbers on the community to start having community meetings. We start from being a victims to a fighters, and we organize our community. This is a grassroots campaign against Alenco Energy. Even though we have 1 or 2 jobs, we came on the evenings and work as a community to put together a plan to be loud in this problem, because it's not a secret. Then for the system, people of color, we are invisible. We don't have voice, we don't have power. But we want to demonstrate that when we are together, we have the power. We start going to City Hall, and it's not only adults, kids, youths, all get together because we care from one another. And you see in this picture, we were loud on this. Even kids has testimonies on City Hall. We organize our youths, seniors, everybody get together and start canvassing our own community, making our own surveys. After we start sharing our stories and making noise, different universities and colleges come to us and want to help us. Now we are working with USC to start a study about breast cancer and oil drilling. Do you see right here, youths making surveys? We take control our own campaign because nobody cares more than us to demanding to live on a healthy community. I'm gonna say that we are so proud that this coming November 22nd, we are going to celebrate the 7th year, of Alenco being closed. We are working on a coalition with Stand Together Against Neighborhood Drilling Los Angeles to establish a buffer, 2,500 buffer zone between oil drilling and censored land. We are very active with Last Chance Alliance, and we want to establish not only local, county, but also statewide buffer to protect the health of the community. And that's it for me.
Great, thank you so much, Monique. I wonder, could you tell us just a little bit about your the recent victory that your coalition had against Alenco? And I know you're in the process of wanting to get those wells decommissioned, if I have that correct. Could you say a little more about what happened there?
Yes, we are so happy first of all, because on the beginning, we are fighting against Alenco for the last 10 years. The first 3 years, nobody paid attention to us because we just, people, as I was mentioned before, invisible, nobody cared about us. We are so happy then we are on the, and I'm sure we are gonna have this facility closed forever. Dagger, well, now Carl James sent an order to shut down permanently they appeal, and I'm not able to share more because it's still in court, this issue. But I believe on the power of the people. And I'm sure then this facility is gonna be closed permanently. And now we are fighting to have this land be beneficial for the community.
Yes, very good. Thank you for saying more about that. I know that these struggles have steps forward. It's never just one big victory where the whole place is decommissioned and cleaned up. It's a long-term struggle, and we have to celebrate every step along the way towards success. And of course, there are still many more steps to go.
Absolutely. And yes, I want to share something that I forgot to share. Alenco Energy operates on land of Los Angeles Archdiocese. And we need to fight, this community needs to fight against three monsters: oil industry, Los Angeles Archdiocese. We are not attacking the faith. I want to make clear. It's not about the faith. And also the broken regulatory system. This small community, people of color, immigrants, low income, embarked to a titanic fight against these three monsters. And we are so proud to say that we are winning.
Excellent. Excellent. And I know you're involved in lots of different efforts in Los Angeles. This is not the only neighborhood impacted by oil extraction or processing or use down in LA.
Yeah, we are working as a coalition to end urban drilling.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yes. And if you haven't been to Los Angeles, it's sort of strange to think about how close these oil rigs often are to people's homes and schools, and there is a lot of oil down in Southern California, and they extract it all over the place. All right, thank you so much, Monique. We're going to turn now to Jayla. Whoops, and I'm going to pass you the controls.
Awesome. Thank you, Heather. Thank you, Kathryn.
Yes, there you go, Jayla.
Great. Thank you to everyone. So I wanted to, my name is Jayla Burton. I am the program officer with Breast Cancer Action, and I wanted to share a little bit about what Breast Cancer Action is doing right now and what work that we've done over the years to address the breast cancer crisis in the face of organization that addresses breast cancer, the breast cancer epidemic at the intersect of breast cancer, the environment, social justice, and feminism. Social justice is the foundation of which all of our work is around, and there are key elements that come into play when we're talking about the environmental work that we're doing. So first, we know that breast cancer impacts communities unequally, leading to unacceptable differences in who's developing the disease, when it develops, and who dies. Second, we believe that in order to address and end the breast cancer epidemic, we must tackle the root causes of the inequalities, which is often a complex interplay of culture, power, economics, racism, and sexism. And third, we also believe that these injustices that exist within our society reinforce each other in many ways and at many levels, kind of how Monique was saying with the three masters that Esperanza Housing is kind of going after. And so moving on, So cancer diagnoses continue to increase, yet only 15% of breast cancers are linked to family history. So it has been time to end exposure to cancer-causing chemicals, hormone disruptors, and other chemicals of concern in our environments that contribute to the breast cancer epidemic. At Breast Cancer Action, we support and work towards the reduction and ultimate elimination of exposure through our advocacy, action, partnership, and education. We began our fossil fuel work over 10 years ago because not only do fossil fuels contribute to climate change, but it also increases our risk for developing breast cancer. So fossil fuels take many forms, including oil, gasoline, natural gas, coal, kind of as Kathryn was talking about in her presentation. And we can be exposed via air, food, water, and everyday items that come from extracting, processing, and the burning of fossil fuels. So fossil fuel extraction can expose people to a range of toxic chemicals, right? So once extracted, fossil fuels are converted into more usable forms, such as gasoline for vehicles, chemicals to make water bottles, food wrappers, cosmetic and personal care products, and agricultural chemicals such as pesticides. And we know that extraction, processing, and manufacturing expose all of us to harmful hormone disrupting and carcinogenic chemicals, but they have the greatest impact on the people who work and live near these extraction and different factories. So all of these exposures increase people's toxic body burden and increase the risk of breast cancer and other health harms, which is why we are dedicated to disrupting the fossil fuel continuum. And so we would love for you to join our movement to power down the fossil fuel economy and prevent exposure to these harmful chemicals. And there's a couple of different ways that you all can join us in doing so. So first, I advise you all to take the first step. Anyone that's here, thank you. This means you care. That means you're ready to take action, ready to take that next step. But for some of you you're like, okay, what does it mean, fossil fuels and breast cancer? And so I advise you to visit our website, which is linked on this PowerPoint, to download our Why We Must Stop Fossil Fuels fact sheet, which is also accompanied by infographics. There's some blog posts, and there's a little bit of history of the work that we've done, the work that our partners are doing in this movement to end fossil fuels. And so moving on, after you get all this information, you know how to take action. So we do have a few active actions on our action page. And so the first one, so we are also a part, like Monique and Esperanza Housing, we are a part of the Last Chance Alliance, which is a California-led coalition of health, environmental, social justice organizations that have been urging Governor Newsom to address and stop fossil fuel projects, drop existing oil production, and roll out setback limits in the state of California. So during COVID-19, not only have breast cancer patients been caught in the middle of two frightening diseases, Black and Brown communities have faced the firsthand effects of systemic racism, and all of the Californians are experiencing the firsthand effects of climate change with the devastating wildfires that are going on. But in the midst of all this, California Governor Newsom has been busy granting multiple green lights to all of these polluting industries by basically allowing fracking permits. And in the first, in the first 6 months of the year, he granted more permits than he did when he first got into office. And so if you live in California, please visit our website. We have an action up right now where you can go ahead and send Governor Newsom a letter asking him and demanding him to stand up to the fossil fuel industry by stopping fracking and issuing those permits. Next, so we also have a national action, which all of you should take action for. We are asking you to contact your representatives to support the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act. So this bill will halt new permits for plastic production facilities. It will update the EPA's regulations to eliminate factory-produced plastic pollutions, and also push the EPA to update existing Clean Air and Clean Water Act emission standards to prevent further pollution. So this is also an action that's on our site as well. So we work with other organizations similarly committed to reducing exposures to harmful chemicals that put our health at risk, and would like to thank Kathryn and Monic for not only dedicating their time today to share the science and the grassroots stories, but also thank you for doing the work in the first place. And before we hop into question and answers, I want to share a few ways for you to get involved with Breast Cancer Action. First, sign up for our newsletters to stay up to date on current actions and issues that we are working to address. You can join us on Facebook and Twitter to change the conversation about the breast cancer epidemic. You can help make this work possible with the donation. So we are fiercely independent and refuse corporate funding from any companies that profit from or contribute to the breast cancer epidemic. So we are largely dependent on individual donations from people like you. And then of course, spread the word to friends, family, colleagues. And then lastly, we would love if you could join us on October 15th as we honor 30 years of radical disruption and compassionate resistance. We will have an online virtual event that has special guest speakers, entertainment, and a time to get to know the breast cancer action community from across the country. So there's more information on that on our website at breastcanceraction.org. So I will go ahead and take this time to pass it on to Heather and open it up for Q&A.
Great, thank you, Jayla. Let's just go here for a second. So we will open it up for question and answer. If you do have a question, just a reminder, you can go ahead and type it into the Q&A tool, which will be in your toolbar, likely at the bottom of your screen. And we do have some time for conversation. So first, I want to thank all of our speakers for really laying out both deep and broad framework for understanding the problem that we are experiencing. I think with the fires in California, Oregon, Washington, and across the western states, as well as the hurricanes that keep slamming the Gulf states of the United States and all over the world, we're seeing a climate crisis, and this raises just so many questions and concerns for all of us. And we know that that is connected to this same problem of fossil fuels. So there's a collective need to really address these issues, and there's a specific need in communities that are especially hard hit. So helping us all understand how breast cancer and fossil fuels connect is important for all of us in the long term. So I'm very grateful for everybody's time and experience. I have one question that was submitted to start off. This question would be for you, Kathryn. It's both simple and complex at the same time. So the question is, how much exposure to chemicals can cause breast cancer? Can a few days of exposure cause a cancer, or does a person have to be exposed over an extended period of time? And you're on mute. Let's see if we can get you off mute.
Thanks so much. Yeah, thanks, Heather. And thank you, Monique and Jayla, for your presentations too, and covering things that that I left out. That was really wonderful. That is a really great question. There isn't a very, I hate to say it, but there's not a very simple answer to this, because this is a scientific answer that everyone hates, right? It depends. So it depends on what kind of chemical it is. It depends on how the exposure occurs. So for example, as we were talking about, it's oftentimes that we understand the health risk to humans from worker exposures who are exposed at very high levels, or people who live in fence-line communities who are vulnerable communities who are right next to these facilities. And that's a different level of exposure than, say, the level of exposure you get from some plastics chemicals, drinking out of a water bottle or heating up plastics. So it's really multi-layered. If you're thinking about one group of people, you need to think about, well, what are their workplace exposures? What are their exposures at home and what are their exposures in the ambient environment, just kind of, you know, for those of us who live in cities, what the general, you know, air pollution looks like, people who are experiencing wildfire smoke right now. So all of those things are additive. They add together to tell you more about a person's risk to exposures to chemicals. I also alluded to this a little bit in talking about some of the occupational studies, but people are also not exposed to one chemical at a time. We are exposed to mixtures of chemicals throughout our lives. So I'm sorry, I don't have like a very definite answer for that question. There's a whole field of risk assessment that tries to answer exactly what the dose is and the timing to really calculate what a person's risk is. But I think that, you know, given what we know about the hazard that a chemical poses, and we know, you know, we can measure if people are exposed to hazardous chemicals, that in and of itself, I don't need to do a bunch of calculations to tell you that we should be reducing our exposures to those kinds of chemicals.
Great, thank you, Kathryn. Monique, I have a question for you. Could you say a little bit more about your community's connection to breast cancer in terms of what you see happening, what people's concerns are, and the way that it comes up in your community work that you do?
Yes, and thank you for that question. I think our community has so many questions about different types of cancer in our community. Unfortunately, we have kids, then we are lost kids for leukemia. We have different type of cancers, reproductive cancers. But we, on the previous study in USC, we definitely focus on breast cancer. We have 25 women who were testing about her conditions, and unfortunately, the number was very small to be statistical important, but we found then from that 25 women, the majority of them has a, I don't have the word, let me see, a density, a dense breast, and we are going to have a bigger study with more women about this, because unfortunately we have different types of cancer, and we want to make sure about breast cancer as well.
Thank you. Yeah, we know that communities often understand these problems long before scientific research documents it. So, so even though your study was small, it points to real concerns and real people's lives that need to be protected. So thank you for your work in that. Jayla, a question for you. With all of the wildfires here in California and the focus really on climate change these days, and of course Governor Newsom, we've all seen him out in his boots walking through the burnt ashes of different communities and talking about climate change. Do you feel like there's an opportunity here that that opens up as more and more people are talking about fossil fuels and climate change and their connection?
Yeah, so I can also talk about like what we've been seeing throughout our efforts within the Last Chance Alliance. What we've seen from Governor Newsom is that he's not blind to the fact that, you know, climate change is an issue. He actually, there's a Washington Post article that just came out, I believe this morning, from, I can't remember or recall who wrote it, but basically just recounting on the meeting that Newsom had with President Trump yesterday, in which he was advocating for President Trump to follow the science, which is, yes, in fact, what all of our leaders should be doing. But we don't want to get too mixed up in the argument that climate change is real. Like, we know that climate change is real, but you know, a lot of the things that he's done kind of contradicts like what he's saying. So like, yes, climate change is real. Yes, we need to do something about it. But at the same time, Newsom hasn't really responded to a lot of the activists that have been rallying, and responded to constituents who have been calling him out for approving all of these new oil and drilling permits within the last couple of months. And so what we're trying to do is like apply pressure to not get too lost in the, oh, it's climate change. It's climate change, but yes, we know what we need to do. And we know we need to stop any oil production products, have the setbacks, and not issue any more permits if we want to make California not so dependent on fossil fuels. So hopefully that answers the question.
Great, thank you. Here's another question for you, Kathryn. With any kind of exposure, does it take many years typically for a cancer to form and develop? So these different chemicals related to fossil fuels, or I think the question is more general, but specifically we're talking about fossil fuels today. What kind of lag time is there? What does it mean to be exposed and then see or not see some kind of effect?
Yeah, that's another really great question. So when we're looking at studies with people, right, we don't normally check out, you know, people's cells every year or every periodically to check for all different kinds of cancer cells. So I don't think there's an exact answer to how long the latency is, but oftentimes with studies are most often designed, well, you can have prospective studies that follow people to see when they develop cancer. That won't tell you when the cancer initially forms, but it could tell you when it's diagnosed by a doctor. And then in studies that are retrospective, where we're looking back at people who have already developed, when we're comparing people who've already developed cancer and those who haven't, a lot of times we're looking back, you know, at least 10 years. So the cancers, you know, before they're diagnosed, it often takes a number of years. And in order for a cancer to develop, right, a number of things have to go wrong inside the body, because we do have genes, as I was talking about in that slide, of pH exposures causing polymorphisms, or causing changes in those genes that are supposed to be our, you know, kind of checks on unregulated cell growth. You know, a number of those genes kind of have to fail in order for a cancer to actually progress and grow and then become diagnosed. So yeah, that can take a number of years, and in some cases, cancer can be growing for 20 years before it's actually diagnosed.
So long term. Thank you for explaining that to us. And then of course there are some studies that show very early life exposures can increase risk later. So there can be,
Yes,
you were mentioning 10 years, there can be lifelong
yes.
delays in these, in the propensity or the possibility of developing breast cancer. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
Monique, a question for you. So I wonder if you could just tell people what people not pozos means. I'm sorry, I think I said that incorrectly, because you had it all over your t-shirts. And the question is, you had mentioned the many layers of struggle that people in your community are dealing with. And I'm wondering if you can explain what the community does to keep hope alive, to keep marching forward. Do you have ways of engaging the youth and arts and culture, or anything that would be sort of the glue that keeps each of you moving forward together?
Yeah, thank you. And people not pozos means people not wells. In this case, people not oil wells. And because we are, I think, Now when gentrification, we are more than 80% of the community, used to be 100% Latin community. Now, when this gentrification, we see a lot of changes, dramatic changes in our community.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the majority of our people are from Mexico, Central America, and South America. And we have that sense of unity and parties and help one another.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not a secret then when what neighbors need something. It's very cultural to help and serve our community. And because we have that roots, because we believe on unity, because we live on supports one another, they keep us together.
Mm-hmm.
And we are resilient because when you came to this country, the only reason that we came is we forced to leave our countries for many reasons. Violence, economic, is not our choice. We forced to came. When we have the decisions to come to a different country, when different language, when different culture, we decide to be resilient. We are strong. We don't give up so easy. And because we love our families and because we deserve to be treated as a human, not as a delinquents, not as a criminals, because we deserve to live on a healthy community, because our kids deserve to live on a healthy environment. We are not afraid to fight with the evil. And I think that love for our family, that love for our community, that love for our culture, for justice, that love for justice, that hungry for justice, we take in our own hands and fight for them.
Yes. Very good. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that.
And I
Kathryn,
want to
go ahead.
just a minute, if you please, this coming September 25th, we are having a virtual fundraising for Esperanza Community Housing. I invite every single of you to go and check Esperanza webpage and join us. We have the more amazing fundraisings, and now we are gonna have virtual, but I promise you that will be so great.
Thank you. And I believe Esperanza is about 30 years old as well, right?
Yes,
your organization.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, yes.
Yes. So good long-term work. It is a long-term struggle, but it requires good people staying in it together to do that long-term, get those long-term victories. So, and you need your parties.
Absolutely. Yes.
So I'm going to squeeze in one more science question here, which I've never actually heard asked before. Kathryn, do you know, are there any studies that have looked at people who are exposed to high level of carcinogens but do not develop breast cancer? And does it point to anything that improves people's resilience in 1 minute or less?
Yeah, no, that's another really great question. Certainly there are, you know, when we look at these studies, it's not everyone who has a higher exposure has a, you know, develops breast cancer. It's not 100%. It's more like we can look within a large group of people, we can look to see like if exposure increases by this much, then the risk increases, you know. So like that example that I gave of DDT, risk, you know, the odds of getting breast cancer increasing 5 times. That's pretty huge. And it's not to say that every single person who had higher exposure developed breast cancer, but certainly the risk increases. And as far as reasons for that, you know, those are really great questions. You know, I think all of these types of exposures that we're talking about really are gene environment interactions. So some people might have a different way that they metabolize chemicals, meaning they are they can break them down more or less. And that can have, an effect on people's risk. Or in the case of those, talking about pH exposures, what happens if the tumor suppression genes are changed and they're not doing their job properly? So there's not just, like I said, there's not just one way for cancer to arise. There's many different pathways. So yeah, it's a great question. It would be really nice if we knew, if we had the answer to that, to say, if you do have high exposures, here's the trick for preventing cancer. Yeah, that would be good if we could figure that out.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I want to thank all of our panelists. You've really helped us map out this big problem, and also a range of areas for hope, the good people doing this work. We need our researchers, we need our community advocates, we need national organizations doing this work on the front lines at the policy level. So this is a wonderful combination of people coming together, and we at Breast Cancer Action look forward to continuing the conversation with all of you. Please stay in touch with us. Thank you so much, and take care and stay safe and healthy out there, everybody. Bye.
Bye, thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.